Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. We are affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is
Jabd.com or the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology.
so instead of making fake journal articles, we're doing the inverse for this podcast, where we look at real journal articles and real sources to kind of figure out what's really happening as far as certain topics go that are often discussed on the internet. So this is episode 7. So this is part 3 of our discussion about housing prices and zoning laws.
I did write a pretty good housing article that might help the listeners. It's about how the armadillo population is further moving north than they currently are because they're getting priced out of Austin.
Oh, you already wrote that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We're going to link that in the show notes.
Yeah.
But anyways, the audio is going to pick up where we kind of dropped off on episode 6. So we're going to get started. And when it comes to, the arguments against mixed use or multifamily zoning. So this is one where I start to lose sympathy when it comes to the other person's argument, because most of the arguments I hear online are honestly really silly. One thing I read was well, if you put a convenience store in your neighborhood, a bunch of homeless people are going to be hanging out there. I used to live in a neighborhood that had mixed use zoning, and it had corner stores, and that didn't happen. It's not a thing.
If you listen to one of our previous episodes, more affordable housing may fix the homelessness problem altogether.
Yeah, and they actually looked at
done.
There's a couple papers that we'll link in the show notes that looked at. One argument I hear is similar to what we just talked about. It's oh, well, crime will go up, and research shows the opposite. And so mixed use developments actually have less crime. Why is that the case? Essentially, there's more eyes on the street, so people spend more of their time hanging out on the street. They're sitting at the corner store. Yeah. There's outdoor seating.
Walking around in the middle of the night, I definitely feel safer if I am in a place with a lot of people, even if it's just a little bit of people walking around on the sidewalk. And you don't really get that in a suburb like you would in the middle of a city.
Yeah, I think in suburbs, unless someone's walking their dog, you don't even see people outside.
No.
And I grew up in a suburb, so this isn't me being hoity-toity. I've experienced multiple different development patterns, and yeah, so the study looked at the different types of zoning. Commercial only has the highest crime rates, which makes sense. If you're going to a strip mall late at night, there's nobody else around. It's probably easier to get mugged. And then next in the danger list was residential only, and then last was mixed use. So if you're walking around the neighborhood and there's people sitting, outdoor seating, having drinks, eating food, just everyone sees everyone, and people start to recognize people. So if you see something out of the ordinary, you'll probably notice it faster. So a couple more things, I think. Public hearings. So I think there's a lot more, the level of democracy, the level of public engagement varies depending on what part of the government is involved. For example, we did an episode on R&D last time, and the public doesn't have a huge say in what type of research things are funded, and certain things should be left to the experts, right? And this is an area, so every time there's anything housing related at all, there's always these public hearings, and part of me wonders do we need that? If you want to add a deck to your house, do you need to have a public hearing? If I read a comment online about someone who wanted to add solar panels to their roof, and they had to have a public hearing, and all these people went to the hearing calling them making fun of them for adding solar panels. It's just why do you need a public hearing for that? So
yeah, there's some things that probably don't need a public hearing. You can just do stuff.
So maybe it should be by right, and then if neighbors are upset, maybe they can go to civil court. and take you to court instead of so basically like do things by right. If neighbors are not happy, they can go through the civil process. Inclusionary zoning, they talked about it a little bit, or I looked into it a little bit. It seems like it helps a little, but not as much as you would think. I think inclusionary zoning is basically building affordable housing within a specific unit. I think it's kind of putting the cart ahead of the horse. The big issue we have is like we're not building enough housing, period. Another issue is why aren't there more condos and co-ops? So condos and co-ops are historically the sort of lowest entry point ways of ownership. There's not a lot of data on this, but it seems like it's an issue of financing where developers are less confident. If developers are building a large multifamily unit, they're more comfortable with the financing coming from, a large owner that'll turn it into apartments than turning it into condos. Because if they do condos, then they have to sell each unit to a specific individual, and there's just less confidence that that buyer on the other side will be available. So that seems to be the reason why there's not as many condos.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting. There aren't as many as you would expect because it's so easy to find affordable apartments. But then when you're looking for condos, it feels like it's a lot more of a limited inventory.
Yeah. Yeah. It is
when you would expect that there's a really good place for condos, also for getting more mixed use and higher density neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I think revisiting the zoning thing, so I think it's a chicken and egg thing, but really I think the cause is really the laws, but they do feed into now everyone in their, internalizes a car-centric lifestyle. So they get mad if there's not enough parking. They get mad if there's too much congestion. So that creates a demand for wider roads, which that's an entire separate issue. Wider roads doesn't fix the problem. It just creates induced demand, and congestion never goes away. Solutions. So one argument is incremental rezoning. So I think if you rezone all at once, if you remove all zoning regulations, you'll get a lot of pushback. Plus, it's easier to just incrementally, change an area from single family to like accessory dwelling units allowed, ADUs, or like mother-in-law suites. So you can build an extra small little house in your backyard, where like one person can rent, and then that'll create, or even better than that is like start out by allowing for corner stores. So first allow corner stores, then people will be walking to the corner stores. There's more demand for more walking centric infrastructure. Start adding gentle density with accessory dwelling units, duplexes, etc.
That's how you boil a frog. Just a
when it,
corner store at a time.
When it comes to, so most zoning laws are local government regulations, and one semi-legitimate argument I hear is like if a local city and its residents want zoning, who are you to say no to them? And that's a fair argument. I think my counter argument to that is, like I said before, most sort of spread out urban development is fiscally unsustainable. So what happens is they're subsidized by the city center, or they're subsidized by the state government, or by the federal government. So my argument is, if you choose to have restrictive zoning and you're running a deficit, basically, without subsidies from the state or from the federal government, then I think you should be refused funds until you upzone your city. Because you're basically saying, this is the way I want to do things. Oh, and you guys have to subsidize it. So my argument is like, we will not give you money if that's what you choose to do. Seems fair to me.
I mean, it's pretty fair, especially considering that, the underzoned parts of cities are more expensive to maintain. So Why should we subsidize it out?
Yeah. Another thing, so the land value tax is a very interesting concept. So most property taxes now, they assess the value of the land plus the buildings on the land. And so your taxes go up if your property is assessed at a higher rate. And so if you add an addition to your home, it'll actually increase your property taxes. So it actually disincentivizes development. So there's an argument that just assessing the parcel of land itself would incentivize development more. So I think that's a very compelling policy tool. For the bottom of the market, I think there is compelling evidence that there's market failures at the bottom of the market. When it comes to, obviously, there's people who get priced out and become homeless. But even people who live in very low rent situations, a lot of times there's deferred maintenance, conditions are not sanitary. And the reality of landlord economics is that they expect higher returns from higher risk tenants. And so what a lot of landlords will do is they'll just like kick the can down the road when it comes to basic maintenance and repairs. So that's also a market failure. So a couple solutions. So, there's housing vouchers. There's Section 8 is the famous one. You can also build government-owned housing. So the research I read basically says that housing vouchers are more efficient. That said, there's examples like Singapore where there's sort of what's seen as a widely effective public housing approach. I think we can talk more about that later. I think another potential solution, I think vacancy taxes are fine. In France, they put in a vacancy tax. It did reduce vacancies. It had mixed results when it came to actual prices. I wouldn't be opposed as long as they account for like, well, what if you're making repairs and, someone can't stay there, et cetera, et cetera.
But that would incentivize contractors to work even slower,
I guess. So with all this being said, and then we talked before about remote work.
Yes.
What effect is that going to have?
There's a lot of talk about remote work. A lot of annoyed people in rural areas, not happy with their new neighbors.
It says, in Housing Demand and Remote Work, NBER Working Paper 30041, John Mondragon and Johannes Wieland found the shift to remote work induced by COVID caused a large increase in housing demand and accounted for at least half of recent aggregate house price growth. So part of it was easy money. Part of it was also people demanded bigger houses. So that's kind of the big thing they saw. Again, I think remote work could potentially, I think this is me spitballing, but I think it could potentially, if there was more remote work and we also had looser zoning restrictions, I think that could create a situation where there's more like small satellite towns around a given city rather than everybody commuting into the city. And so if you look at
that would make sense. Yeah.
So if you look at cities in the US, you have,
I feel like
if you
Dallas is the perfect example. Yep. There's Dallas.
Yeah. The houses just go on forever. Or
Dallas is 90% satellite city.
Yeah. These are different cities, but they're basically effectively all part of Dallas, right? Whereas if you pick a random place in Europe, like if you look at Prague, you'll have the main city, but you'll also have these like little hamlets outside, like that are like actually physically separated, but they're still relatively close to Prague. And so I think there would be more of that if we loosened zoning restrictions. Whereas right now, like in Dallas, like there's a huge blob that goes on for like miles and miles. Technology solutions. So I think this. So I found a think tank, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and they go into a few technology solutions. So one is, I don't know how legit a lot of these are. Like one, they're making an argument for innovation. One is mass timber and tall wood. So basically, taller wooden structures. Um,
Yeah, because wooden structures are really height limited by
yeah,
regulations.
and then you also have structural insulated panels. These panels basically they can streamline the production process and lower costs compared to traditional stick building.
Yep.
And then they also talk about prefab or modular building. So basically, have a lot of sort of pre-built pieces, like kits, basically, and kind of
Yeah,
like
which basically cuts down on labor and probably cost because you're building it in a factory. And on top of that, when you typically build a large building, you need a pretty large staging area to bring in materials.
mhm.
And from what I've heard, prefabbed sections make that a lot easier for higher density construction, higher
Yeah,
density neighborhood construction.
and like so there's a continuum when it comes to procurement and production of anything, not just houses. There's like the commoditized version, and then the other extreme is like bespoke. Bespoke contract. You build a one-time thing, um, and housing is more on the latter end, where like you build the entire thing from scratch. Um, usually there's like common designs, but you're building everything on site from scratch, basically. So there's a compelling argument like, why can't you just build it from existing modules? And then innovation for is 3D printing. I don't want to go into this, but who knows? It might help.
It seems like 3D printing is the old, we'll fix it with AI
Yeah.
solution.
So there's a few policy like, because my thought is like, why don't these things exist already? And this website's arguing that there's a few policy changes that need to be. Like it says right now, there's mostly um, specific measures required to achieve goals. For example, to promote energy efficiency, some state buildings codes require the use of specific materials. And this website's arguing you should have performance-based codes. So like, not how you get there, but what's the result. It says some states allow a third party to certify prefab segments in the factory's building as meeting code. So maybe make it easier to make coding laws easier, coding rules easier for modular housing, forestry and mass timber for econ development, etc. So those are the solutions.
Let's make fun of some bad solutions.
So one is like, we should ban investors from owning any single family homes. I think so. One problem with this is like, if a family wants to live in a single family for a year, it's hard to do that unless you rent, because buying and selling is selling is very expensive. Buying and selling is very time consuming. And so there is a niche. Like, let's say you're living in a city for a year. There is a niche need for rentals in the single family market. There's also a study that showed, basically looked at, what's the effect of banning investor ownership of single family homes. And basically, it actually increased rents. And the way it did was it decreased the supply of rental units. It did increase home ownership rate, though, so that's the flip side. But it wasn't a panacea that reduced housing costs overall. Housing prices also didn't change that much in that study. So, it's not like, I don't think it's a big deal if they're banned, but I don't think it's going to really fix the problem.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna. I don't think that's a huge part of the market.
And a huge argument I've read about like, the anti short term rental people is like, well, if there's a demand for short term rentals, that should all be controlled by the government. And first, that it doesn't really fix the supply problem. But also, like, housing authorities in cities they're not development experts. They're not experts in risk assessment, attracting capital, finding vendors, having those relationships, etc. So I'm very, very skeptical that like mass conversion of like, you know, current rental units into like government owned rental units. I'm just skeptical. Studies show that
Yeah.
they cost more than private builds. And also, current political climate doesn't allow for long term maintenance of public housing. That's an issue that's happened in the US.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, we're struggling already with Social Security. I don't know how we can have the political will to build another massive social safety net like public housing.
so the issue, I mean, it can work. I think the issues that have happened in the US is one, there's no political will to pay for maintenance. Two is a lot of times they're basically segregated housing. There's like huge towers built away from like where the wealthy people live. Whereas I think a smarter way to do public housing is to just integrate it into the overall city. So have, build a building there, just kind of put them everywhere. Another thing people talk about is retrofitting. They're like, now that there's remote work, we can turn office buildings into apartments.
Oh, I've always heard that one.
It is very difficult to do this. First, there's the zoning issues.
Would you rather spend a year living in a cubicle or a sleep tube?
Sleep tube, 100%.
Oh, more than a cubicle?
Well, it's more, you got more privacy.
That's true, but you wouldn't really be able to stretch out.
So, first, there's the zoning issues, but assuming those are fixed. Plumbing and electricity is actually very different. There's a lot less plumbing in office buildings. There's far fewer bathrooms, a lot less electricity. Because really, each floor has like one little area where they have bathrooms, and then, there might be a small kitchenette.
Yeah, I think the most you'd be able to do is like barrack style housing, which is basically
not.
You could do one floor as a homeless shelter.
So you could either do barrack style housing, which is currently against zoning rules in most places, but assuming that problem's fixed, that's one option. The other is to turn each floor into like a giant condo for like multimillionaires to live in. But you can't really take one floor and turn it into like normal apartments. Also, the middle of the building is not going to have sunlight. And so if there's requirements to have windows for each bedroom, the middle of the building, you can't turn into bedrooms. Also, if there's regulations about like you need to be able to open. I know this isn't always a thing. I know in your apartment, you can't open the windows, right?
Yeah, I cannot.
Yeah, so in some cities, there's a requirement that windows need to be openable for residential, but most office buildings don't have windows that open.
That is true.
That's another thing. I think when it comes
that
to
would have to be part of the retrofitting process. I think the plumbing is probably the biggest. The plumbing in the middle of the building is probably the hardest part to fix. But I bet you can fix most of the other parts.
And I think even if it was theoretically convertible, I think it's just cost prohibitive for most buildings where like it's just not worth it for a developer. So now we're going to talk about the topic of rent control, which is...
So what is rent control other than a sign that you're probably from New York City?
It could also be a sign you're from San Francisco.
Oh, they have rent control too?
Parts of it do, I think. But there's different types of rent control. There's, there's normal rent control where they're like, this is the price of rent. The government says this is what the price will be. There's also rent stabilization, which is more about controlling the rate of increase of rent. So they'll say, this is rent stabilized. Landlords, you're not allowed to increase rent by more than X percent a year. So different models, same basic motivation. It's effectively, sounds noble, but there's problems with it. Effectively, it's a form of price control. And any economist will tell you that price controls basically lead to shortages. So basically, there's a mismatch in supply and demand caused by price controls. So I mean, as far as the pros go with rent control, quite obviously it makes housing more affordable for someone who lives in a rent controlled apartment. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. You know, if you're living in a unit that's below market rents, by definition, it's more affordable for you. So for those people who are in rent controlled apartments, it is very much something that makes housing more affordable. It also reduces displacement, so you're less likely to essentially be forced out of an apartment because of price increases and things like that. That said, you know, what are some issues you think could happen because of rent control?
I mean, if there's no money in maintaining it or really making a good development, and people are going to stay there just because they can afford it, I imagine this is a pretty decent excuse to be a slumlord or just to sell the land outright and not be a rent controlled apartment.
Yeah, so
I
that
just feel like there's not a mechanism for improvement like you would for continually making luxury apartments, which slowly turns into normal housing, as we discussed in the previous episode.
yeah, so the Brookings Institute has an article that talks about some of the issues. So one is, you know, it kind of reduces mobility. So you can have situations where tenants are basically in a unit and financially it basically becomes impossible to move out of that unit. So they basically, you can have mismatches where you have, you know, large families in a cramped unit, or, you know, you'll have these empty nesters who, you know, no longer, you know, maybe they're in a relatively large unit and they no longer need to live in a unit that big, but they're like, well, this is such a good deal. We're not going to move out. And so it can create situations where it's like, okay, do you really want a large family stuck in a small unit? Do you really want like an old couple taking up, you know, a 4-bedroom unit? And so it can cause that. And that can also be an issue when, you know, mobility can be helpful when it comes to the job market in some ways. You know, if you can move to another city because of a good opportunity, that's great. But, you know, if you're like, hey, like, that's a good opportunity, but like, I can't justify it because I have such a good deal right now. So it does reduce mobility. Also, like you said, what ends up happening is that oftentimes these properties start to get neglected by landlords. So, you know, so one thing they say here is rent control can also lead to decay of the rental housing stock. Landlords may not invest in maintenance because they can't recoup those investments by raising rates. And then they quote some other people as far as that research goes. So, I mean, basically, you know, if you're a landlord and you have rent controlled units, your return on them goes down, obviously. And every investor has in their mind, they're like, for this risk profile, this is the return I expect, et cetera, et cetera. And so if they're in a position where they're getting, you know, mediocre returns for essentially a tenant that they consider higher risk, you know, and this is, you know, perhaps this is debatable as far as, I mean, you could definitely argue this is unethical, but what a lot of landlords do is they're like, well, the way I'm going to get back to where I need to be is to just stop doing maintenance. At enough, you know, not to the level where complaints happen and they get in trouble with the law, but just enough to kind of skirt that line. And so that's what happens a lot of times. They're like, hey, I'm going to try to recoup, you know, I'm going to try to mitigate the losses as far as, you know, low rents goes by spending less money on maintenance. It sucks, but it's a thing that happens. Another thing that happens is basically, according to, so there's this article from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they basically found that rent control increases the rents of non-controlled units and reduces the overall housing supply. So, I mean, this is basically the shortage that I described as far as rent control goes. So, I mean, effectively, what rent control does is it removes units from the market, because for most of those arrangements, there's a massive incentive for tenants to never leave because, you know, for obvious reasons. So those units basically are no longer part of the housing stock from the perspective of the overall market. So it reduces supply. Reduces demand as well, in the sense that there's, one fewer person looking for new apartments. But the overall trend, basically, that this article found is that rent control increases. So landlords reduced rental housing supply by 15%, causing a 5.1% citywide rent increase. So, I don't think it's common for cities to have rent control on their entire city. I haven't done enough research on that, but usually there's specific units or specific sections that are rent controlled within a city. And essentially what seems to happen is that the sort of savings that people benefiting from rent control get are basically, lead to other renters getting penalized with higher rents. So, it solves the problem for some people and causes more problems for other people. So essentially it transfers the problem from one set of people to another. Another thing that happens, go ahead.
Yeah, they'll have to institute some of the techniques. And have you ever been to the subreddit Love for Landlords?
Isn't that like a satirical?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things they talk about is just like, I can't believe my rentoid didn't give me my 20% tip on rent.
Yeah. So
and the mandatory fridge raids.
So anyways, basically there's a couple other things. Another thing you tend to see is, according to, there's this sort of research institute in Berlin called DIW, and they basically looked at some other effects of rent control. And one thing it does is, a lot of landlords will basically try to do what they can to get rid of their units. So they might do condo conversions. And I think the logic behind this is, and there's a couple other papers I'll bring up later, but basically there are certain criteria that cause something to be a rent control unit, and there are usually loopholes that allow landlords to kind of escape that status. So there's another article from Stanford Business School, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and they basically found that, this process happens where they convert certain units to condos so that they won't be rent controlled anymore, sell them off, even demolish and rebuild as new apartments. And a lot of this essentially encourages gentrification and, again, sort of leads to unintended side effects. The most extreme example, there's a New York Times article on the concept of frankensteining, which is something that they're a loophole they're trying to close in New York. But basically what happens is, like, let's say a landlord has a unit that's under rent stabilization. So what they'll do is they'll basically reconfigure the apartment. So they'll basically, one thing that can happen is they'll buy a multifamily unit. Let's say one of the units is rent stabilized. They'll buy another unit, another part of the sort of multifamily thing, and basically say, you know what, like, once one of the tenants leaves or whatever, they'll say, like, hey, we're going to combine the two units into a bigger single family unit. And then because of this legal loophole, it's no longer a rent stabilized unit. And so it has perverse effects because this used to be two units and then they combined it into one unit. So, it's the same amount of physical space, but now it can only serve one household. And so, ironically, it ends up reducing housing supply. And this actually happened. I saw a video, I forgot who the YouTuber was, but I actually saw a video on this as well. And basically there's this weird perverse effect where a lot of these multifamilies are being converted, are being combined into single families in New York, in, the middle of the city. So basically the end result when it comes to rent stabilization and rent control is that, it helps the people who are lucky enough to be in those units, but, it kind of hurts everybody else. It increases rents for everybody else. It can end up reducing the supply of housing. It can reduce, it can basically reduce the quality of housing because of less maintenance being done, etc. So, it ends up not really working as a solution. A few sort of unrelated topics. One is like rent versus buy. What are the economics? Is it always better to buy? It honestly depends. There's calculators you can see online. There's It's not as easy to calculate as you think. Like if you're buying, you have to pay for the mortgage. You also have to pay for maintenance, repairs, um, utilities, and then there's the opportunity cost of the down payment. So you could have made investment returns on the money that you used for your down payment. When you rent, you can account for that. You can say, well, I'm making returns on what I would have used on my down payment, but you're also paying rent. So the answer is like it honestly depends. Honestly, in most large cities, it's cheaper to rent. Like if you look at condos in New York City, like if you tried to buy one and rent it out, like you would cash flow negative pretty hard. So in a lot of really big cities, makes more sense to rent. In more affordable areas, it makes more sense to buy. There's a big real estate bubble in China. That's another topic. That was more of a demand issue. I think they are not supply constrained. They're actually the opposite in China. They built too many units. They would often, developers would often sell homes before they were finished, and use the proceeds to start financing additional construction. So that was more of a demand problem in China. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
Ooh, let me think here. We never brought up homeowners associations. That Do those have any actual effect on zoning? They get blamed for a lot of things.
I think HOAs are kind of dumb, but like if you choose to buy a house that has a HOA, like that's on you. Um, I don't know. I feel like most zoning restrictions are at the city level. Um, HOAs typically they have like really annoying rules about like mowing your lawn and stuff like that. I imagine if cities loosened zoning laws, a lot of HOAs might make their own laws more strict. So
Yeah, that's a hunch I have because it always kind of feels like they operate in that domain, but don't really have to do much because the zoning laws are already kind of in the favor of the big spread out, nice looking lawns.
yeah, and then let's see. I
But I
think
guess they don't have that much of a direct effect.
I think and then you also mentioned the conspiracy theories about
Oh well, there's
you,
there's two main ones other than what we have mentioned. One is that I guess this is more of a economic theory than a conspiracy theory. Is that when boomers downsize and die off, the market's going to get flooded with all of the property they've been holding on to, and prices are going to crash.
so I haven't looked into this, but I'm skeptical because one, a lot of properties are going to be passed on to children. So
Probably.
there's like no market transaction happening there. Um, Another thing is like they're not gonna they're not gonna all die at once. Like it's gonna happen over 20 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, it's not going to be all at once, but it'll probably be a slow shift. I've heard that,
It
and
might.
then
I think there's a decent argument that it can soften. It can maybe prices will flatline a little bit as that process happens. It's possible. Um, and then
I
what was the
bet you
other
there's
thing?
going to be some effect. I guess the speculation is how much of an effect is it going to be?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know
When
enough
when will
about that.
the when will the youngest boomers likely start downsizing?
The youngest boomers are like
Or no, I
60.
guess it'd be the oldest. How old are the oldest boomers?
Oldest boomers are
Oh,
like 80 now. So they're
okay. So
starting to
they
die.
should have already started downsizing by now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if we don't see any effects in the next few years, I don't think we're going to see much of any.
And what was the other thing you wanted to talk about?
Oh, well, we have to bring up the conspiracy theory that I always hear that the globalist elites want to set up the world where no one owns anything and that we're renting everything.
So another thing I hear about, so there's a thing called the 15-minute city that I don't know, some agency or organization brought up. And
Oh,
the
yeah,
idea,
that comes up a lot when people talk about this.
and the idea is like everything you need will be a 15-minute walk from your apartment. And these like silly people are like, oh, this is the start of the Marxist takeover of society. It's like, is that what happened? Did Joseph Stalin start installing bike lanes, and that led to like the Bolshevik Revolution? Like, no, that's not what happened. It's because like the counter argument is like freedom is, you know, needing, living a 90-minute walk away from the closest grocery store. And the only way to get there is to get inside a vehicle where the government requires a government approved license to operate the machine. Like, you cannot use a car unless the government lets you. That is what a driver's license is. Is that freedom? Because that kind of sounds like the opposite.
Yeah, well, I think it's especially Americans and probably some other cultures too have like a direct association between owning and operating a motor vehicle and your freedom because I could go just about anywhere with that thing. Just hit the open road. What are they going to do? Stop me? And
Yeah, I mean, I
there's
would
some level of control keeping you within a 15-minute city. I guess is where this is from.
if the government started banning cars, then I would get worried. But like living in a city with convenient amenities does not mean you're not allowed to own a car. Like, you own a
Yeah,
car and you live in a downtown area, right?
yeah, and that's like honestly a 15-minute city is what I think most people should strive to develop in their own communities because that's just generally healthier for everybody.
Yeah.
But there is some conspiracy theory going out there that they're going to make it and then they're going to take away the cars and then you're going to be trapped there.
Well, see, cars, you need a government approved license to operate, and you need to drive government maintained and built roads to drive around. I don't think it's liberating at all to need a car to drive to get groceries, you know? So I just think that's silly. So anyways, that's it for us. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.